This oral history of museum computing is provided by Diane Zorich and was recorded on the 24th of May, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Um, I guess maybe I'll just start with when I started at the Peabody, because I was kind of a one-woman shop when I came in. And I was also going in hoping that it was going to open a door to something totally different. And that would be museum curatorship. I did not want to necessarily work in technology. I took the job because I thought it was a foot in the door that would allow me to go elsewhere. And it was quite a shock to the system, because they had already had a VAX computer, with its own air-conditioned, climate-controlled, so to speak, room, running a Unix system. And the one person who knew it a little bit was the collections manager at the time. And so they wanted somebody to come in and take that over. I did not know Unix. Had not even heard of Unix. So I bought a couple of books about Unix, and immediately thought, whoa, I am over my head on this. But eventually kind of just, trial and error, learned a lot of things. My favorite Unix story there is when I had to upgrade Unix, and that involved something called creating a new kernel, right, for the operating system. I had no idea what I was doing. So a colleague said, hey, you're at Harvard. They have a computer science department. Ask. So I did, and they assigned me a young undergraduate, which I was told they do. This is like an opportunity for undergraduates to kind of get real world experience, right? And I met with this gentleman. We decided we were going to do it on a weekend because we didn't want to disrupt business when we knew it would go south, right? So I met with this young man on the weekend, a delightful, quiet, very smart young man who walked me through the paces, and together we created a new Unix kernel. It worked, brought it back up. I thanked him profusely. I wanted to take him to lunch. I said, what can I do to thank you for saving my life and my job? And he said, no, this was great. It was fun. Okay, fast forward 1 year. This news comes out that there's a worm that had been let loose on the internet inadvertently, the first ever, and it took down all these systems. And it turns out that the young gentleman who had helped me was the person who had released this worm on the internet. Robert, what was his last name? You can look it up. I forget his last name. And I couldn't believe it, because he was such a quiet, mild-mannered, smart kid. He is now at MIT as a professor of computer science, but he did serve jail time for this, you may recall. Yeah, so it was inadvertent, but not, apparently. You
I
can
never knew that story, Diane.
You didn't know that story? It's on Wikipedia. If you look it up, just Google, internet worm, Robert, whatever, and you'll see his name. Morris, that was his name. I think it was Robert Morris. So I immediately freaked out, thinking, well, what? But it was a year past. The system had worked flawlessly. Nothing. He was totally did the best work he probably did as an undergraduate on that system, because it was such an old system. But that was kind of a funny little factoid that happened. But that kind of system, I eventually was able to hire people to do data entry, hired somebody to actually migrate us off that system, and then Kathy came aboard. And I left, so that's where that went. But I'd bring up the story, I guess, to talk about in the early days of this, you had to really rely on yourself. And we talk about agile development. You had to be an agile person to take this stuff forward and work with it. So then I went into consulting for 2 decades, where I didn't do so much actual technical work as much as policy and analysis work, which I actually enjoyed and I felt was more in my bailiwick than the technical. although, you know, again, when I was at the Peabody, I was there with soldering irons, making my own cables because we had, you know, CRTs back then and they went into different offices and I wasn't, you know, I couldn't get security to come in or facilities to drill holes in the wall. So I drilled holes in the wall and ran cable. And, you know, again, you did everything yourself. But now, fortunately, I hope that is no longer the case. And we are a little bit more mature in both our infrastructure support and in the people coming in and their knowledge base. So after having worked for 2 decades with consulting, I took this job at the Smithsonian for a number of reasons, one of which I've been consulting for the Smithsonian for a while, so I already knew the system and the federal system, and I knew the people in this office that I would be running, and they were all top-notch, and I thought, this is, where else am I going to ever have an opportunity to walk into a job where I know the people already, I know the setup, and I know they're all really wonderful and professional, and they will, you know, they had been running the office on their own for a year without a leader anyway, so I was probably a pest at that point because they were doing it all themselves. So I took the job and I kind of knew this might be my swan song, you know, it would see me out because I had already was, you know, as they would say, a mature professional. And since then I have learned, you know, Paul, you talked about your students learning from my 2 discussions with them. I learned all of that myself when I came into it. And it was wonderful to be in an environment like that, where I had people working ostensibly for me, but in fact, I realized really early on my role was to remove obstacles to let them thrive, because they had come up with these programs and these plans. They knew the system, and the only thing that was holding them back were the bureaucratic and other budgetary, other obstacles that come with any job. And so that my real role there could be to try to help remove those obstacles so that they could go forward and do what they wanted to do. And I still feel that's a large portion of my role on a day-to-day basis, trying to find funds, trying to showcase their work so people see the amazing things they've done, because often it's hidden labor, hidden products, you know, and you know, the people will go outside and say, we need somebody to 3D scan something, but we have an in-house team that is stellar at that, you know, and they just didn't know it. So I'm kind of always out there trying to sell this group, even among the Smithsonian, especially among the Smithsonian, actually, because it's a large organization, it has 6,000 people. You know, you can't possibly know everybody. And you can't possibly know all the projects going on either, which is amazing and also a liability sometimes, especially with a team like mine where we could help on so many of these points. So that's kind of where I'm going right now with what I do. It's not so much, I need to know the technology, I need to know it at a high level, but I don't need to be able to have used it, you know, to have that deep hands-on technology, because the team has that, right? So it's a different level of maturity, technological maturity, where you kind of know how it works, the best use cases for it, where it should be used or not, and then you make those opportunities, you line up those opportunities with your team and let them go at it. So they've done some amazing things, as Paul has heard, and they continue to do amazing things. And I will I will fight anybody who says that we don't have the best 3D, for example, team in any museum, and similarly, mass digitization team, although the British Museum might dispute that, but I'll fight. So yeah, so we have these amazing teams, and that's really what it's all about. They're the ones that learned early on. Another thing they've taught me is that although I go to museum technology conferences, they often did not. They found the best return on their investment of time and money, since these conferences are expensive, was to go to tech conferences in their area. And that had a dual payoff. It sharpened their skill sets, right? They saw state of the art, what was going on in industry and commerce. And it also introduced those industry and commerce sectors to us. And if we have one amazing benefit, it's the Smithsonian brand. I have been time and time again gobsmacked at how you just drop the Smithsonian name and people don't question it. They're just like, yes, we want to work with you. You know, it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. And it happens all the time, and every time it happens, I'm amazed all over again. But industry wants to work with us. You know, they won't give us money because that's not done anymore, by the way, giving money. They will give in-kind services, they will give expertise. You know, they will work jointly on projects, but nobody, another thing, everyone gives money and walks away. You know, they want an investment in it as well of some sort. So, but that's actually been a real positive, I think, because we continue to learn from each other. You know, we had, for example, a partnership that started before I came on board with Autodesk and the 3D team. And Autodesk is like this major, you know, CAD company. And even though we no longer have a day-to-day kind of working relationship with them, they still, every once in a while, we know we can call them or email them for anything, insights on something, vice versa, and they will do the same for us. So for example, just the other day, our 3D program manager got an email from somebody very high up at Autodesk who was talking to the Computer History Museum, who was looking for a new 3D viewer. And she told them, the best 3D viewer out there is the one developed by the Smithsonian. So she's linking our team with their team. And you would think, okay, that's great. So maybe they'll use our viewer. It's open source. We want people to use the viewer. We're happy to help them set it up within limits. And it's another museum. So of course we want to help. But there's really something very much deeper going on here. The Computer History Museum is located in Silicon Valley and has relationships with technology companies that are unsurpassed for a museum, right? Just because of the nature of what they do. So if we can work with them, if they like our 3D viewer, you know, there's a possibility of other relationships and collaborations developing. And so that's the kind of the other thing I try to do is look long-term at what might look like something very simple today, like just helping another museum use our 3D viewer, right? Will have payoff down the line. And it's a long game. It's not something that I might see happen this year, next year, or even in 5 years, but maybe further on. And that's where much of our expertise has come from, to be honest with you. We've had these kind of long games going out with different technology companies who contribute little pieces here or there. Sometimes it's, you know, helping us develop something, like the first major huge scan we did of the Apollo command module, which was huge. And Autodesk actually wanted to do it at a very high level of resolution because they wanted to test their software on a huge data set. So it was a win-win on that. But, you know, our team learned a ton from that project and from their engineers. And we continue to learn from them as going forward. So that's kind of the other end of this here, is that building partnerships. I'm used to building partnerships with museums, and they're still important. I don't deny that, but from my group, the longer term partnerships with technology companies have proved more useful in the long run. And working with these companies in a way that is not just saying, give me money, because they want to be valued, right? They want the association with the museum. And that might just be the Smithsonian brand, but I bet other museums would have similar success in that way. by saying, let's do a partnership. It's time consuming, and there's a lot of education that has to go on, because technology companies often come in as if they're a bulldozer. We know the answer, we can help you. And so they have to learn about us, and we have to learn about them. We have to learn about their corporate culture, how things move through their system. They have to know how it moves through our system, which is further complicated by being a federal system, but the long-term benefits, I'd have to say, are huge for both company and museum or us. So that's kind of, I feel like that's what I have to say.
I was just
if there's any, if there's something you want me to, if you want to prompt me on something that I haven't thought about.
I do.
Okay.
I always thought the work that you did on information policy was important, Diane. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and how some of the consulting that you did helped to integrate that work into the museum field.
Early on, I realized, again, because it was early days, we were jumping into technology, but we didn't have any policy about information, and it was all really about information. And so I was kind of thinking about these things and looking around at things. And the first place I looked was libraries, because libraries were always my idol. They seemed to have their whole act together, right? They had vocabularies, and they had thesauri, and they had cataloging systems. And then when I looked closer, I realized, well, of course they do. It's so easy for them, right? They have a book, or, it replicates itself, it's like, we have one of a kind. And even when we have one of a kinds, nobody can agree on what that one of a kind is, So that's when I did my first article, that Library and Museums, Beauty and the Beast, because I thought, I see this, why doesn't everybody else see this, that there's real distinctions here? So I kind of laid it out that way. And that article, it's kind of funny because it's really old now, and it was in Spectra, right? Not a widely distributed journal. I still get people telling me they teach that in classes in information school, because people come in thinking, well, why can't you do it this way? Libraries do it this way, archives do it this way. And it hasn't changed, seriously, the issues at the core haven't really changed. The solutions might have, new solutions come up, but they're always going to be different than libraries. They're always going to be different than archives. It's just the nature of the beast. So then that kind of got me thinking more about, well, museums need information policies then. Libraries, the great thing about libraries, even if we can't use their policies, they've got them. Now we should have them as well. And every place I worked at in the early days, the 80s and 90s and the early aughts, didn't really have policy and wasn't thinking of information that way at all. And many still don't, I think, to be honest. I know at the Smithsonian, it depends what museum you're in, and if you're a library, you're pretty good. The archives are pretty good, but the museums are still not quite thinking information. There's still a sense that that's kind of infrastructure. We don't have to think about it, but in fact, you do. So, yeah, that's kind of, did that answer your question, Kathy?
Yes, but I want to say a little bit more and have you respond. So during that really tragic fire at the Brazilian Museum,
Yeah.
I thought of the line in the chapter that you wrote for the Marty and Jones book, or how having the information and having it secured would be so important.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I actually wrote a little blog post on that on the DPO blog, and I got some pushback. It was really interesting, and it made me think a little bit. In this blog post, I kind of argue, in the context of that museum fire, if things were digitized, you'd at least have you'd have a surrogate, an image, ideally, and you would have the records, right? And you could do research from that, a certain amount of research. And although, yes, it's incredibly tragic that the originals be them specimens or objects, are gone. You have something to go on. And, you know, similarly with if there were 3D models of some of these things, you know, I mentioned that, you know, you can't smell a 3D model, you can't touch and feel the same level of the original as you can on a 3D model, because the 3D model is going to be a plastic kind of thing. But you've got something there that you can work on. And one of the things I learned from my mass digitization program, which is just 2D imagery, I don't mean just, it is 2D imagery, is how much research can be done from an image. And in fact, that team, when they go around and do mass digitization, and people say, well, what resolution do you do it at? Our mass digitization supervisor calls it the object whisperer. He looks at the object and he asks the curators, at what level of detail, at what level of resolution do you need to see something on this object to be able to study it from an image? And they tell him, for example, the stamps at our National Postal Museum, they need to see the engraving markings. That's a different level of resolution than in the botany collection, where they need to see whether a fern has spores or not, right? So each collection determines that. But the goal is to be able to do research off of this. And to go back to the information policy, it's really incredible. The pushback I got was, yeah, that's in an ideal world, Diane, but you know, nobody can digitize their entire collection. There's just too many things in our way and always have been. And that's true, but that means we need to argue better for ourselves of why it's so important to digitize. Because if this stuff goes up in smoke, literally or figuratively, all you will have is your records. And your paper, if they're paper records, those may go up in smoke too. So you really do need some kind of digital representation, and that's up to the museum to decide as to what that is, to be able to have some accountability nowadays for your physical collection, yet we still don't do that.
So Diana, I remember, I think your whisperer gave a talk during our weekend with you.
Yes, she did.
And, you know, it gets back to a theme that Paula and I have heard throughout about how we are now listening to the users and letting them help us program for them instead of knowing what they want, you know, and doing it our way, not you, but other people.
No, it's true. And we've kind of learned that during the pandemic. You know, we have a lot of digital assets, right? But then the pandemic came and everybody's doing things intermediated through a screen, including teaching and K through 12. And suddenly digital assets become really important for K through 12. And we're finding, not just the Smithsonian, every museum, that their assets they're there, but K through 12, they're not there in a way K through 12 can use them, right? And that's because nobody really asks them. You know, how do you need these assets? You know, how can we make them easier for you to incorporate in your curriculum? Nobody has really had to, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure people have done this. But as a group, as an entity, museums have not been good at asking their audience. And K through 12 is a huge example. So we have these assets, and we find in the DC public school system, for example, they love our assets, but they can't use them for two reasons. They have to be bilingual, according to the DC public school system. They have to be accessible in terms of for people who have disabilities, right? They're not. You know, we have to make them that way. We need to up the game here, folks, to make these usable. Yeah.
Well, that's a really good point. So is Congress going to give you all that money to do that?
No, Congress gives us 60% of our budget, and they're always fond here of saying that 60% keeps the lights on. Basically, it pays for the facility management, but none of the special programming. That's all raised by public, you know, shop revenues, licensing, and public. We have a public trust arm, which is nonprofit that we can fundraise from. And that's where all the programming comes in. Now we do get some funding every year that's appropriated for, quote, digitization, but that's broadly interpreted and usually goes to technology infrastructure, not digitization. Yet, you know, we are held accountable. We still have to go, and our secretary has to go to Congress, as well as the folks in our budgeting office a couple times a year to report on what we've done in the digital realm, you know, and they really want numbers. How much have you done? How much more have you done? Which is very congressional, isn't it? Because really, you know, we had this open access initiative we did. Thankfully, February of 2020, it went out. Boy, that timing was good. And there's over 3 million assets in there now, image in 3D, and 14 million metadata records that are open and that have been used amazingly. You know, the stats are great. But we haven't had a chance to add much to that, and probably won't, because the facilities are closed and we haven't been able to get into digitize. So we've kind of moved to records digitization in this period, because the museums are less concerned about letting their records go out for digitization than they are the objects, which are, you know, our objects are fragile, require much more time and investment in money to move those out. You know, card catalogs, easy to do, just box them up and take them over. So we've been doing kind of digitization and experiments with machine learning and OCR on records to try to see if we can get these metadata off the cards into digital records and enhance them at the same time. So because we don't have any money to do this beyond our traditional budget, we're looking at machine learning to see what can be done automatically by machine to a high level of confidence. And then the rest would be done by human transcription, things that just can't be done. But we're finding that a lot of the machine learning and the OCR even, it's getting really good at handwriting recognition. You know, the problems we have is it's not just always handwriting. Sometimes it's just, you know, if you think of natural history collections with specimen labels, there's these labels, some are typed, some are scrawled, and over time, more and more of these labels come up. And so it's more of a management thing than actually a transcription issue. But that's kind of where we're looking now.
I'm sorry, that's what I was just about to jump in and say. Another theme we've heard a lot is this misunderstanding of what digital work is. And when, and especially about something like digitization, people think it's taking a picture, right?
Yeah.
But and they don't see the vast apparatus of management that surrounds that.
Yeah, that's true for both mass digi and 3D, more so for mass digi, because the whole idea is to leverage the economies of scale that come with big numbers. And that means moving these collections from storage to a digitization station and back safely. And in our facilities, that is a real challenge for many. You know, we have very old buildings. We have offsite facilities. We have over 1,000 storage spaces total, you know, from every broom closet that has something in it to huge spaces in our museum support center in Maryland. And getting those things is not trivial to get them. One of my favorite stories, and Ken may have told you this, that I think it's one of his favorite stories too, is when he was in charge of the mass digitization project at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum in New York City. Their storage area is actually in Newark. Okay, so they set up shop in Newark for 18 months, and they would bring things over to the digitization station in carts, you know, wheeled carts, but they had to go through doors, and there were two problems with the doors. They had to be physically opened, and the carts were getting a little jarred as they went through them. You know, sometimes the object handlers were going a little too fast. It was making the conservators and everybody nervous. Okay, so he put in sensors that automatically opened the door when it saw something coming, and that cut off 4 seconds in getting the objects from here to there. But over time, that 4 seconds added up. He did, because this is what he does. He's amazing. He's a logistics superhero. he was able to equate that savings of time into money. And it was huge. It was almost something like 6 figures. So, you know, and that's something of just shaving 4 seconds off of a door opening. That's what you have to do when you're thinking of that scale. You have to look at the physical infrastructure. There are also issues, some of our buildings, we don't have internet drops to all of the sections of our buildings. In fact, most of the storage areas were chosen in some of the buildings because there's no internet drop. Nothing can be done there except storage, right? But we need to sometimes bring internet drops in, you know, to be able to use barcoding and scanning, and we want to automate as much as we can and get it online. So some areas don't have electrical outlets. We have to put in electricity, right? Drop electrical wires. So then we have to bring our facilities people in. So it's a huge checklist of things that we go through before we even click the first shutter. You know, it could be months of planning before you actually do anything. And you need the entire staff of the museum to know that, right? Sometimes the nearest way to get from A to B is to go through a public section of the museum, which nobody really wants to ever do, but it's the nearest way. So then you have to figure out, well, do you want to do that? Or do you want to take more time in the project and divert it to back hallways, which are safer, right? You have to talk out all these things, you know. Who is equipped to move objects? Not everybody is a natural born object handler, as we've learned. And then once they get to the digitization station, who sets them up, you know, for the best viewing? And you have to go fast. I mean, the whole idea is to be able to move fast, almost in an assembly line process. If you have to stop and artistically pose each picture, you are defeating the process. So, you know, these are all these kinds of things we have to think about. With 3D scanning, it's not quite so bad because we don't have the volume, right? It's very expensive to 3D scan, so we tend to not do hundreds of thousands. In fact, if we do 80 to 100 at a time, that's huge for us. So it's not quite the same thing, but the process of actual scanning is more intensive and requires more expertise.
So Diane, that brought up 2 things for me, and that's one is working in old buildings and having people understand what you need to do to upgrade the infrastructure. And then the other thing was seeing the botanical collection scanned. And the question there is, were you able to use that technology, that process for other things during the pandemic?
We were able to, interestingly, keep the botanical project going at a reduced scale. Maybe just 3 people at a time in that space. There was a number of reasons that we were allowed to do that. The museum agreed. We had developed work safe protocols, which required, now they seem standard, but when we started, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was by no means standard that everybody was wearing masks, washing their hands, checking in and checking out, so that if an outbreak of COVID came out, we could always do contact tracing, right? So we had a whole work safe protocol set up first, and that took a couple of months. And then with that, the museum agreed to let a smaller team come in, so that continues to go, but we have not been able to go into other museums to do any of our other projects beyond what I mentioned with these records, taking the records out to digitize. So they've kind of made a big pivot in the MassDigi program from objects to records digitization right now. Also, the conveyor belt is not ours. It belongs to a vendor, which again, our mass digitization program manager totally thinks is the way to go, because if it breaks down, it's their problem, right? They have to fix it, and quick. And because we don't have a budget to speak of, if we had to buy hardware, you know, technology, cameras, the way they change so quickly, the technology, scanners, we'd spend all our money on technology. It's become our philosophy to hire vendors who specialize in this and keep up to date with the technology. And then we manage the projects or the people or the projects. But the hardware itself, our 3D scanning hardware, almost all of it is on loan to us from technology companies. And that botany conveyor belt is part of the vendor relationship. We have a contract with a vendor who does the transcription on those sheets as well.
That's great. So how will you link the information on the cards that were scanned back to the objects when that can be done?
Yeah, that will actually probably take place initially through accession numbers, right? The discussion right now is these, every museum has different cards. Some have ledger books. The formats of these things are very different. So when we do an analysis of OCR, machine learning, and human transcription and what can be done, each project has to have that done separately because the format, the physical format is different. So most of it will be by accession number. So we've set up scripts and ways to do that. So our images, once we take them and they're QC'd and approved, go right into the DAMs. And then if the DAM's permission is that they can go public, they then go out to the websites or the aggregators or wherever the museum is designated as public for them. We're still in early days on this, I'll be honest, with the record digitization. We're doing pilot projects to see where the flaws are. And that's kind of how we started with the mass digitization and the imaging projects. We started with these clean pilots, worked through the whole process, saw where there were problems, did another pilot that addressed that problem, continue, so it was an iterative process. And we're still in that iterative process for the records digitization as well.
And I have forgotten, but do all of the museums use one system or do you have to push it out?
Yeah, most of the museums use TMS,
Okay.
but we have a few outliers. The Natural History Museum uses EMU, as does the American Indian Museum. And then the American History Museum uses, I don't know if it's still called MIMSI.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I often talk about the Smithsonian as being a federation of museums, right? Each of the museums has their own director, staff, and budget, and they report to this mothership called the Smithsonian.
Sort of like Battlestar Galactica,
yes,
and other ones we might know.
So it would be great to be able to say you must use TMS, but we cannot. So instead, we create workflows for those systems so that the data goes into the system depending on the museum and their system. They all filter into the same DAMs. That's true. That was a major achievement to get people to do that.
And what are you using, Piction?
Open text.
Okay.
And now we're creating a 3D repository because we have so many 3D assets. In addition to CT scans, which the Natural History Museum folks do a lot of. And it was getting a little worrisome with how safeguarded these files are going to be. So we are, our 3D team, and this is a great pandemic project because it can be done so remotely, is developing a 3D repository. A group of developers and the team are working on this. So that will be the equivalent of our DAMs for 3D. We did try putting 3D files in the DAMs, conventional DAMs. They're just not they're not set up to handle the complexity of 3D files and the size too. So yeah, in fact, we just demoed a minimal viable product for our CIO the other day. And when it gets more robust, it will be open source, so anybody can use it as well. Yeah. That's the other thing I like about my team. They keep doing things that will be open source.
Well, I was actually just about to ask about that. I mean, one of the themes that have cut through a lot of these oral histories is shifting perceptions and philosophies about openness in museums, right? So you were talking about Voyager 3D Explorer as open source software, and now more open source software, and we've got open API to collections, and of course the whole open access images movement that's been happening. What do you think is behind the shifting philosophy providing more open access for museums?
Yeah, you know what? I think this is a win for museum grassroots professionals. Seriously, this did not come top down, you know it. This came from the bottom up, and the bottom pushed it up and met a few from the top who were open-minded and willing to try it, right? And the Smithsonian was obviously not the first out the gate. In fact, maybe we were the 200th out the gate internationally. But that was okay because those 199 before us or whoever gave us ammunition to show that they did it and no one died. It was okay. Nothing untoward has happened. So that was really important in convincing not only senior management, but legal departments, who are often, it's their nature to be risk averse, to show that. So yeah, I think we should all of us in the trenches should pat ourselves on the back for the years of hard work on that. But of course, I don't think people think of it that way, right? But it really was people in the trenches who knew that this wasn't going to kill anybody. And it was, for us too, we have a very public mission, because we are partially taxpayer funded. We are seen as America's museum, although we feel we're global. The truth is we do have to be accountable to Congress and the taxpayers for their use of their money. So it's really hard to justify not making this stuff open. This is the American public's collection, how they're paying with their tax dollars. And yes, they get free admission to the museums, but that's not enough. So that public mission also helped push us over. And I know all museums say they have a public mission, but it's different for us. We really do have the American public supporting us financially. So.
Well, no, I think I appreciate you saying that. I'm searching for the right words here. When you look at the sweep of the history of museum computing, it fills me with optimism to see these initiatives having moved forward. We've heard a lot of stories of people being depressed at this point or some challenge here, but you look at the overall arc and we've come a tremendous way.
And you know what I think the next one's going to be is with DEAI or IDEA, depending on which acronym you use. We use IDEA here. Because I see emerging professionals making that a new point for their work going forward. And I think that's terrific. There's so much more here than legal issues, right? There's the moral, there's the professional. I see that coming from the rank and file, at least in the passion for it. Sometimes I think if it comes from the top, it's not necessarily passion as much as, oh, well, I've got to do this for legal reasons, but the passion for doing it for the right reason is coming from the rank and file.
Well, I was just gonna say, it speaks to the power of each generation of museum technology professionals as they come in and push ideas forward, which many ideas wouldn't get that kind of traction if they didn't have that passion that they brought with them.
Right, absolutely.
Kathy just put something in the chat about empathy as well.
Yeah.
Right? It's
absolutely
so important.
Yeah.
We were talking last week with Douglas Hegley, and he was talking about the role that the museum plays in encouraging global empathy and connecting communities too.
Yeah, and we're doing that now. The Smithsonian much more because of our leader, right? Lonnie Bunch, who came in with, he's just like, it's our 175th anniversary, by the way, this year. And, we could go back and reminisce and rest on our laurels. And he's, we should do that. We should always celebrate, right? But you should also say, okay, where are we now? And are we meeting the moment now? And we aren't. I mean, he has been honest with that. We are not meeting the moment. And he wants us to, as we should. So I think having the right leadership is really important too. So I think where this is going to spin off into digitization for us is, we used to, and we still do to some extent, digitize based upon what the priorities of museums are. But the priorities of museums have technically usually been the priorities of collections management and exhibition and loans, right? And I think we need to move that a little bit more, if not a lot more, to what the public needs are. And so, for example, Lonnie has made as his kind of vision going forward is that we address issues of the pandemic, sustainability of our planet, and racial and social injustice. And we got tons of collections that can speak to that, right? And stories. So I'm hoping the museums will feel pressure to say, yeah, it'd be nice to have this done because then I could finish my database. But really, these things tell a great story. Let's bump these up in the queue and do this. I know they're doing that for 3D because 3D is just made for storytelling, right? For the mass digi, it's harder for people to think that way. It's like they want to do one or two things and we want to say, do the whole collection, get your hands in it and you'll find that lots of it could be used to address. Don't just cherry pick. So it requires a little bit more of a leap.
Well, when you put out the whole collection, you don't know how people are going to use it.
Yeah.
It's about remaking and reusing. And
exactly. Yeah. And, yeah, absolutely. So, and if we're going to do one or two, we might as well do, as Ken says, don't give me 2,000, give me 20,000 or 200,000, because I can do that for you really quickly. And then you have that much to do. You have that much to work with,
Diane, it just made me think, I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this right, but you can tell me if I'm not. When the Museum of African American History and Culture was beginning, before it had a place, it had a website.
Yes.
And what I began to see was that they were collecting tags and they were understanding how people wanted to use the collection.
Yeah.
And if Lonnie takes that into the whole of the Smithsonian, then you can begin to see what stories need to emerge.
Right.
And what you then need to digitize.
Right. Well, also we have this huge retrospective amount of work, right? Mm-hmm. So our American Women's History Initiative has taken that on as a challenge to surface, women in our history mm-hmm. who haven't gotten the due they should. And that's been a fascinating project to watch, okay? Because they are using a lot of machine learning to try to uncover from records women's names who are often recorded as men's names or Mrs. Man's name. And, they've unsurfaced so much and brought so much attention to that. So one of the areas that I think we'll be doing more work in, and this will probably be at the grassroots too, that pushes us, is what some people we call reparative cataloging, right? To go back and look at our cataloging and see what voices aren't being exposed, right? The silences in the record. And we've got a team of people in the grassroots working on discussing how we can tackle that at an institution as large as the Smithsonian. What first steps can we take that get us some wins that help us go to the next step and the next step and the next step? Because it's just, you see this and you start in it and you don't want to get paralyzed by the depth of the problem, which is easy to do with all of our collections. and the size of the records and all of that. So, but everybody sees it. And, you know, and this is where I think, you know, we'll find, again, another thing that the emerging professionals take the lead on.